Good afternoon and welcome to Cognitive Law's webinar on Recruitment Company Directors 2 a.m. problems. What keeps recruitment company directors awake at night? We know it's normally money or people in various different shapes or forms, but you can't always put your finger on the cause or the cure. So don't be afraid. By joining this, we won't tell anyone what your 2 a.m. problems are, but it's unlikely to be anything that we haven't heard before. We are recording this webinar so that we can send it out to anyone who hasn't been able to join us. If you have anything you want to raise, please feel free to put it in the chat box or contact me separately if you don't want to discuss your nightmares in public. But in my experience, there are 7 main subject areas that cause 2 a.m. problems. First of all, business partners whom we may love, like or loathe. Employees, their behaviour and their departures. Clients and candidates. How to make sure you get paid. What exactly the conduct regulations are, what is IR35, and what other laws should I know about? Those are the questions that are often brought to me after a middle of the night panic. I'll start off with number 1, business partners whom we may love, like or loathe. Most recruitment companies are set up in good faith by friends or former colleagues, and a lot of those are ideas rich and cash poor. Those business partners often have the same values and goals, and they don't see the need to formalise their relationship in writing, which is completely understandable. But what it does do is overlook the importance of setting out where everybody stands. The Memorandum of Association and Articles of Association, together with the Shareholders Agreement, are the building blocks of any limited company that has more than one owner and should be the first stake in the ground when the company is set up. The Memorandum of Association is usually created when you register a limited company at Companies House. The Articles of Association, they define the purpose of the company and contain the rules or the constitution of the company that the directors and shareholders must follow. And that includes financial provisions, such as paying yourself dividends. You can either use standard or model articles when you set up the company, or write your own. But it's the shareholders agreement that is the document that a lot of new companies ignore. But that's the agreement that sets out how the shareholders can exercise their rights in relation to that company. In a lot of companies, it won't matter that there isn't one, unless or until the owners have a disagreement or one of them wants to exit. And if the exit isn't harmonious, there are no rules governing how you part company without a shareholders agreement. The least ideal situation is 2 equal shareholders who fall out and there are no pre-agreed rules to say how you're going to part company. It's a bit like a divorce. So if you are setting up a company, do make sure that the foundations are solid, because they're going to form the bedrock of how you go forward with your new venture. Employees, can't live with them, can't live without them. But the next step on most recruitment companies' journey is to take on staff, because it's the only way to grow the business. And whether they're employed or freelance, you have to, by law, give them a written statement of particulars of their relationship with you. But what you will want to do goes way beyond the basics if you're going to protect your business. And that's the obvious, that's the contract of employment. The primary area of focus for most recruitment companies will be restrictive covenants. But this is an area that most companies get wrong. It's tempting to try and put in terms that restrict outgoing consultants from doing anything forever. But that won't be enforceable, and you'll be left with absolutely nothing. The aim is to protect your business from when a consultant leaves by preventing them from competing with you for a certain period of time, or from soliciting or dealing with clients and candidates by using the knowledge gained whilst they were employed by you. But those restrictions must be reasonable in scope, duration, and relevant to the employee's role in the business. That's why it's so easy to get wrong. I also suggest that you link these to confidentiality provisions, which impose a duty on your employees to keep your company's confidential information secret both during their employment and after they leave. This includes client and candidates that they've connected with on LinkedIn, as well as your databases. Another topic that is coming up quite a lot at the moment, and I know is causing some concern in the industry, is how to safeguard against bad behaviour on work jollies. There are so many instances of when employees have embarrassed themselves, the companies, and their colleagues whilst drunk or worse. Most of the time, this is adequately dealt with in the company handbook, setting out what behaviour is and is not acceptable, and what the consequences of unacceptable behaviour are. But a further step that I have taken recently is to prepare a disclaimer for a recruitment company client of mine that taking a big team overseas who wanted to preempt and protect against unacceptable behaviour whilst abroad. Another area that often causes concern where not enough attention is paid is mistakes made in the company commission scheme. I've seen various commission schemes over the years, from back of the fag packet to 5 pages long. Any variation of them work in practice, but what is absolutely critical is to have a lawful clause dealing with when those commission payments cease on exit. Quite a common mistake is to make the last commission payment on the last day of employment, but that overlooks commission which is earned up to that day too, but it might not be due until later for payment. But failure to pay on your part could be a breach of contract, and that's then going to make the restrictive covenants unenforceable. Clients and candidates, again, another bedrock of your business. And every recruitment company that places any candidate with a client needs written terms of business with their clients, and agency recruiters need a matching set of terms with their candidates. That's not to say a contract isn't formed without written terms of business, it may well be. But without written terms, you've got no specific provisions governing who is going to do what and when. With regard to written terms, I did a really unscientific LinkedIn poll recently, and only half the recruitment business owners had terms drafted specifically for their company. That means the other half had either borrowed them from their previous business or employer, written them themselves, or bought them off the shelf. Although that means they do have terms of business, the chances are that those terms that they have begged, borrowed, or stolen don't actually reflect how they want to do business. In fact, a lot of recruitment company owners that I speak to don't actually really understand what their own terms say, as well as being a little bit embarrassing if they're questioned by clients or candidates. That means that their consultants almost definitely don't understand the basis on which they're making placements. So your terms of business, they define how you do business, from your fees to your payment plans. But they do more than that, they protect you. They protect you against clients and candidates not doing what they should. They protect you against unlimited liability if you don't do what you should. They can pass obligations, protections down the contractual chain in order to protect you. They protect against offers being withdrawn, candidates being taken on direct or introduced to third parties, and most prolifically against backdoor hires. Unless your terms of business expressly exclude the requirement for your agency to be the effective cause of the candidate's engagement, you're going to have to fight tooth and nail to recover your backdoor fee. Well-worded terms can avoid myriad problems because you've set out your stall from the outset. But terms of business do have to be sent to the client at the time you start working with them, not after you've introduced the candidate and not with your invoice. Ideally, they should be signed or at the very least acknowledged. And this is something that can't be ingrained enough into your consultant's psyche and training. But what about perm candidates with whom you don't have a contract? I advise a candidate declaration that gathers all the information that you need: the right to work, references, consent to process personal data, and most importantly, the right of representation, preferably as a sole agency. If you don't gather that information, you're actually not even compliant with the conduct regulations, and that's seriously going to hamper your chance to claim a backdoor fee if the need arises. Once you've made your placement, how do you make sure you get paid? This is best broken down into 3 primary stages. The first one of which is credit management. This starts right at the beginning of the relationship with your client. It's about carrying out credit checks, ensuring that you know exactly who you're working with, and enshrining your payment terms into your terms of business. I also suggest thinking about taking out credit insurance, which protects you if you trade on credit terms in the event of client insolvency or protracted default. If you're an agency recruiter, you may have a managed policy, especially if you use an ID facility, but you do have to remember to comply with the terms of that policy. For example, reporting overdue debt within agreed timescales, reporting adverse client information, and monitoring adverse change to customer credit ratings, particularly if your ID facility has a discretionary limit. The next stage is credit control, and I can't overemphasize the importance of having a robust credit control procedure and sticking to it in order to maintain cash flow. If you're not outsourcing your invoices to an ID facility, there really should be a designated member of your team who's going to check who has paid what and when. I strongly advise against raising invoice after unpaid invoice. You just end up with a huge debt, which is probably going to end up being written off. You need to think about it from a reputational perspective as well, whether you want to be known as the recruitment company that doesn't mind if its clients pay late, or if they unilaterally extended their credit period. At the end of the day, if the work's been done, you're entitled to be paid for it. The older a debt gets, the harder it is to recover. So I always say, do not delay in pursuing it. I quite understand about preserving client relationships, but the only good client is a client that pays you. And this isn't a shameless plug for work that we can do on debt recovery, because this can all be done in-house by you and set out in your credit management procedure. You can send a formal demand for payment, and you can issue a debt claim. My only advice is to just keep on top of it. Now, shutting back doors and how to do that is one of the biggest bugbears of recruitment companies. And this is obviously the situation that arises if your client takes your candidate on direct or refers them on to someone else who takes them on, cutting you out of a fee. What this does is highlights the importance of having really tight terms of business with your clients and making sure they've seen them from the outset. They've got to be incorporated into the contract you enter into with your clients, sending them off right at the start with that introduction. If your terms have defined an introduction, you can rely on it. If you've defined when you're entitled to an introduction fee, a transfer fee, or a third-party introduction fee, you can rely on it. You need to be able to express how you're going to quantify that. Is it a margin on a placement? Is it a fixed percentage? Or how do you calculate it if you don't know the salary? You need to make sure you're the effective cause of the placement, or your terms say you don't have to be. And you have to have a demonstrable paper trail. The importance of having everything in hand before and during the process is how you can shut the back door. I'm not entirely sure there are many recruiters lying there at 2 a.m. asking themselves what exactly are the conduct regulations. But it's amazing how many of my clients come to me and say, well, yes, I've heard of them and I kind of know they apply, but what exactly are they? Why do they matter? Well, the Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Businesses Regulations 2003 govern your conduct, and they're incorporated by law into your recruitment business. They're not part of IR35, they're not part of the agency worker regulations, and they apply even if you're doing business overseas, if you're contracting on your terms under UK law. The conduct regulations set out the information that you have to obtain from your client and give to your candidate. You're more than likely abiding by them, possibly without even knowing where those rules come from. For example, Regulation 5 restricts you from charging a candidate if they're a perm candidate. Regulation 9 requires you to obtain a candidate's right of representation. The confusion often arises in agency recruitment with regard to opting out of the conduct regulations. The first thing you have to know is that a recruitment company cannot opt out of the conduct regulations. Only a PSC can, under Regulation 32, and solely at their choice. To be effective, they must give notice to the recruitment company, who gives notice to the client before the assignment starts. It doesn't mean that the whole of the conduct regulations don't apply anymore, just certain provisions. For example, Regulation 6 restricts capital through another agency. Regulation 10 restricts temp to temp and temp to perm fees. Regulation 12 controls whether you can withhold payment if the client doesn't pay. In April 2020, the conduct regulations were amended to bring in key information documents. This is a document that you must include information relating to the relationship between an employment business and a PAYE contractor. It's likely to be the same information that's included in an assignment schedule, but you have to give the KID to the contractor before the contract is signed, and it can't be more than 2 pages long. So it is very different from your terms of business. I'm hoping again that not many recruiters are lying awake at 2 o'clock in the morning asking themselves what IR35 is, but there's still a huge amount of misinformation. IR35 was born in Gordon Brown's budget in 1999 and implemented in 2000. It's actually named after the Inland Revenue Press Release number 35, and it's often referred to as the intermediaries legislation or the off-payroll legislation. Its purpose is to remove tax advantages from off-payroll workers who are actually disguised employees hiding behind intermediaries, which, as we know, are PSCs or limited company contractors. The question boils down to, if the PSC was taken out of the equation, would that contractor really be self-employed? If they wouldn't be self-employed but for using a PSC, they're probably paying less income tax on dividends and no national insurance contributions. Whether they're employed or self-employed is determined by three main limbs, all of which have to be satisfied. The first one, you'll have heard that bandied around before: supervision, direction and control. There must be none, nor the right to. Can the contractor control how, what, where and when they carry out the work? Substitution. The contractor must have the unfettered right to substitute themselves without any personal service being required. And mutuality of obligation. There must be nothing between you and the contractor that says one of you must do something to make the other one do something. For example, the client can't be obliged to provide work for the contractor, and the contractor can't be obliged to do it. Unless you can satisfy all three of those, 35. Until April 2017, the financial benefits of being outside of scope to the contractor wasn't questioned by HMRC. There was absolutely no incentive on the PSC to declare themselves inside of scope. Why would they? Why would they pay more tax if they didn't have to? And nobody was checking. But the finance bill, introduced in April 2017, made the off-payroll rules, and it shifted the responsibility in the public sector for deciding if the contractor's limited company was inside or outside of scope to the client. But it made the employment business responsible for paying any tax and national insurance. It was so successful, creating another 58,000 taxpayers and raising £410 million in tax, that in April 2021, the off-payroll rules made their way into the private sector. So now every contractor can enjoy status determination statements, although it does only apply to medium and large clients. Because the changes last year moved the decision about whether the contractor is inside or outside of scope of IR35 away from the contractor and onto the client, but it moved the liability to make the tax deductions to you, the recruitment business, understanding IR35 applies at all levels of business. Most recruitment business owners understand the implications of obtaining or not obtaining a status determination statement, and they've amended their terms of business, set up payrolls, engaged with umbrellas, or moved to a consultancy model. But it still remains a risk area on which training consultants negotiating roles cannot be overlooked. So are there any other laws that you should be aware of? The Bribery Act 2020, according to which bribery is offering someone something of value to influence them to your advantage by improper performance of a function or activity which should be performed in good faith, in trust or impartiality recruitment, and the preserve of government officials or sports match riggers. But bribery takes place at much lower corporate levels too. And it doesn't just take the form of cash or gifts, it can be hospitality. And not too long ago in recruitment, it was fashionable for umbrella companies to offer consultants cash cards for sending a contractor their way. That's bribery. On a more elaborate and creative level, I have seen firsthand an umbrella company ask consultants to raise funds so the umbrella company could pay the consultant a backhander for sending them a contractor. That's bribery. because the gift is potentially influencing an impartial act which might not be to the contractor's advantage. It's easy to see how this applies to individuals and employees as the briber and the acceptor of a bribe, but it's also an offence for the business not to prevent bribery. It's absolutely crucial to stamp it out and train against it. Most end clients and pretty much all RPOs will ask a recruitment company for some sort of warranty that they have internal practices in place to prevent bribery. Some recruitment companies just agree without any internal policies or training. But if they're found out, the company, as well as the individual, will be on the hook. The Modern Slavery Act 2015 was enacted to prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. And it dictates that companies with a global turnover of more than £36 million must have a slavery and human trafficking statement. You probably think that doesn't apply to you if your turnover is lower. And you may also think that you're a really nice employer, you pay your staff well, and you don't lock them in cupboards. But that doesn't mean to say it doesn't apply to you. Under Section 7 of the Modern Slavery Act, it's an offence for a commercial organisation not to prevent slavery. And it's not always if you're supplying temps. If you're part of a long supply chain, it's quite feasible that the worker at the bottom could be on very low rates of pay and possibly even a 0 hours contract. That's why Transline went bust and ended up in front of the government select committee when it was discovered that 1,700 of workers they supplied to Amazon were being paid below the national minimum wage. Although the law may say that you don't need a slavery and human trafficking statement, you may still have to provide one to an end client who they themselves have an obligation to obtain one from you to show transparency in the supply chain. Or you may have to provide them with a warranty or indemnity that you protect against it. But whether you have to do a statement or not, it's another strict liability offence, and you can be found guilty of modern slavery even if you didn't know it was going on. The first step to ensuring that you don't fall foul of this act is by obtaining every candidate's right to work, and that's regardless of where you are in the supply chain. Even on a moral basis, you should have an internal policy and do some training internally so that everyone throughout the business knows what it is and how it can be prevented. The last law that I think every business owner, not just recruitment companies, should be aware of is the Criminal Finances Act. This was primarily enacted to try and prevent tax evasion. And it's another strict liability offence, which means ignorance is no defence. You don't have to have been guilty of it yourself. You can just be guilty of allowing it to happen. It relates to any kind of taxable income, PAYE, national insurance contributions, VAT, corporation tax. And if you think how that could relate to false self-employment in terms of PAYE and NICs, this is why it's so relevant to recruitment companies. So once again, have reasonable prevention procedures in place and train your staff. Those 7 areas are the primary issues that, in our opinion, keep recruiters awake. I'm more than happy to discuss others, either here or in private. And we do have a message on the chat. No, we don't. I got that wrong. If anyone wants to ask anything, please feel free to get in touch. Here are all our contact details. But if you don't have any more 2 AM problems, then sleep tight.